very much for sharing this beautiful evening with us. I'm Caitlin Mueller. I'm faculty here at MIT in the Department of Architecture, and this is the third lecture, final lecture of our Building Technology lecture series for spring 2016. I'm really happy to welcome all of you here. It looks like we have some people who I know and some people who I don't, so that's always a good sign. And I'm super excited to introduce our speaker for tonight, who is Professor Jenny Sabin. Jenny is currently an assistant professor at Cornell University, where she teaches in the Department of Architecture in Emerging Technologies and Design. And Jenny is quite unique in her outlook as a designer and as a researcher. She does things like wins major awards and grants in the fields of art and architecture, and then also wins awards from the National Science Foundation and publishes in Science, the journal Science and Wired magazine, and sort of really high-end science and technology venues. So she's really at the forefront, I would say, on both sides of art and science, and contributing really significantly on both sides. And she collaborates really effectively with really diverse teams of people, which I'm sure we'll hear more about tonight. Jenny originally studied ceramics and visual arts, is that right, at Washington University, and then was trained as an architect. She has a master's of architecture from the University of Pennsylvania. She taught there for 6 years, I think, until 2011, and then she started on the faculty at Cornell, where she still is now. And I'm not going to go through all the lists of awards she has, but she's won basically every major award so far, I think, in architecture, and has a really exciting publications list that ranges from kind of her interests at the kind of in digital fabrication, computational design, and kind of material thinking, but also on, I found out today that she also has published on things like the architect and computational designer Anne Ting, who was a collaborator of Louis Kahn and someone who taught at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1960s. So she has a really interesting and diverse range of interests that I'm sure we'll learn more about tonight. So I think without further ado, thank you. It looks like the maybe last person just arrived, perfect timing. Please join me in welcoming Jenny Sabin.
Thank you, Caitlin. Can you guys hear me okay? All right, great. Thanks for coming out on such a beautiful evening, and also towards the end of your semester. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been here several times and lectured in the computation sequence a few years ago, so it's a real pleasure to lecture in the building technology sequence. This is one of our new toys that I bought about a year ago, and I'm teaching an option studio this semester, which is actually the first robotic fabrication studio at Cornell. And I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I just heard word from my assistant that we've just blew all the breakers in this room. So we're having a lot of fun with 14 students, and the title of the studio is Biosynthetic Robotic Fabrication, Digital Handcraft, and Weird Tectonics. So I'm going to start my talk with basically a kind of a mission statement, talking about the trajectory of the work, some of the theoretical background, and also talking about some of the history in terms of how I got started. And then I'll talk about three topics, and within each of those three topics, I'll describe a few projects, both within the core lab, the fundamental research, which is now called Sabin Design Lab, that's housed within the Department of Architecture at Cornell, and then also my studio practice, Jenny Sabin Studio. So I'm going to address the title of my talk, Matter, Design, Computation, through the lens of my transdisciplinary collaborations, with a fundamental interest in developing an alternative material practice in architecture. And this is done through the generative fabrication of what I call the nonlinearities of material and form across disciplines. And this video is a compilation of a series of data sets, visualizations, and simulations that have been co-produced over the years with my collaborators. So I don't think I need to tell all of you in this room that certainly biology and material science present incredibly useful conceptual models for us to consider as architects. And it's here that form is in constant adaptation with environmental events and cues. Geometry and matter operate together as an active elastic ground, what I call a datascape, that steers and specifies form, function, and structure in context. And it's through the direct references to the flexibility and sensitivity of the human body that I'm interested in developing adaptive materials and architecture where code, pattern, environmental cues, geometry, and matter operate together as a conceptual design space. It's the embedding of material systems with biological relationships and behavior to generate models that on the one hand are natural and on the other are artificial. And on a meta level, this marks a shift away from Cartesian formal orders of column, beam, and arch and towards interiorities, networks, fabrics, and fibrous assemblages that are both pliable, plastic, and open. Now, this interest also probes the productive tinkering and misuse of digital fabrication machines informed by issues of craft, of the human hand, of making, to produce bio-inspired material systems and software design tools that have the capacity to facilitate embedded expressions in our built environment, to delight, to provide play and joy. And similar to Detlef Merton's description of the term he coined bioconstructivisms, the emphasis here is upon the analogic negotiation of morphological behavior, not necessarily biomimicry, as a dynamic template that is then filtered through material organizations to produce models that are both natural and artificial. Now, we also purposefully resist the post-rationalization of complex form through an approach that engages materially directed generative design, so integrating constraints found from materials and issues of making along the way. And it's here that architectural affordances reveal themselves as evolving flows of force through geometry and matter that are then computed, designed, and fabricated. These transformative models may in parallel provide potent contributions towards very important issues such as sustainability, construction, digital fabrication, and material ecologies in architecture. But we purposefully resist solutionism in terms of a technological series of applications as a primary goal, but thinking about how those applications may emerge through our design process and research process. So one of the fundamental questions that we ask is the following: how might buildings behave more like organisms in their environments, responding to and adapting to their built environments? So as Caitlin mentioned, I frequently find myself in spaces that aren't typically frequented by architects, but I think here at MIT that is a very normal thing. This is a photograph that was taken on the first day of a course that I co-taught with a cellular molecular biologist, Dr. Peter Lloyd-Jones. And we taught this for 4 years in the Department of Architecture at Penn before I accepted my position at Cornell. And we also launched a hybrid research and design unit called Lab Studio, where we paired graduate architecture students with postdocs and scientists and PhD students in the context of both the lab and the studio setting. Now, importantly, early on, we didn't set any clear goals in terms of applications in biomedicine or in architecture, but we had a shared commitment in the co-production of a truly collaborative space, and thought that at the very least we would come up with some new questions that we could bring back to our own fields, and at most, new applications on both sides of the fence. And one thing that I'll mention in terms of looking back over the last 11 years of this work, in terms of an investment of time that has proven to be incredibly crucial, Peter and I spent about a year just figuring out how to communicate. And so he attended my design studio reviews, I attended his weekly lab meetings, and we quickly found that although we shared many like terms, we had very different definitions for those terms. We had incredibly different structures for how we conducted research, different structures for how we teach, how we publish, how we garner funding, how that funding is disseminated, and so on. So Once we had established that year of communication, we also established a friendship. We had many fights and debates. We then launched Lab Studio and decided to teach this course. And I will say a few of these people in the image became a part of Lab Studio and now are doing really incredible things, teaching as professors, completing PhDs in cancer biology, coming from an MArch and so on. So what Peter introduced to me early on is the extracellular matrix. He's a matrix biologist by training, and this continues to inspire and inform all of my work, both in the lab and also in my studio practice. The big idea here is that half the secret to life resides outside of the cell. So you have DNA or code, but that DNA is acted upon by environmental cues and events within this dynamic protein network. So it's a master regulator of function. It's a historical document. If you have a scar, that's registering an event that took place. It's a repository of biochemical and biophysical information. And so I became quite fascinated by the dynamic reciprocity between context, this dynamic ECM, an architectural textile of sorts, and how that was informing form. And I'll come back to this in a moment. And so this presented to myself as well as my team a series of really potent ecological models to consider. Another longtime collaborator of mine, Dr. Xu Yang, we continue to collaborate formally through grants and projects that are funded primarily through the National Science Foundation. She's based at Penn, and her field of expertise is material science, and she engages biomimicry in the true definition of the word. She looks to nature for models to extract, synthesize, design, and re-engineer new materials. So one of the topics that we've looked at together for a number of years is structural color, amongst several others. For example, looking at the wings of particular butterflies, the morpho butterfly, and how changes in pattern and geometry can in turn, to our scale in terms of what we perceive, elicit a change in color or transparency. So it's entirely wavelength dependent in this context in terms of how light reflects and refracts. And I'll talk specifically about one project that engages that work. She also looks at the leaves of lotus plants and the feet of gecko to produce sticky materials and superhydrophobic and superhydrophilic materials, or water repellent or water absorptive materials. Now, relatively new collaborator, Dr. Dan Lau, he's based at Cornell, and we have a collaborative NSF grant together that I'll talk about based on Origami. And he's in bioengineering and he's doing some incredible work with 3D printing. He's 3D printing hydrogels with synthetic DNA sequences and 2 enzymes to program matter and to get it to actuate and fold in particular geometries and patterns. And so we're looking at a few ways of beginning to scale up those features and effects. And again, I'll come back to that. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we didn't set any set goals in terms of applications, but over the course of the last decade, there have been 3 distinct phases that continue to emerge in all of the work, whether it's fundamental research or an applied project. And typically that starts with the development of a catalog of tools to model behavior and processes, sometimes coming from natural models and systems, other times based on mathematical processes and so on. And some of those tools are brought into the realm of architectural prototyping, engaging a materially directed generative design process, and human scale relationships, so productively contaminating the process with the stuff of making and fabrication, and also to meaningfully deal with the problem of scale. Never have I been interested in simply scaling up what might be a beautiful form found at a nano to micron scale into an architectural form, but instead to embed a set of processes and behaviors into material protocols. And then some of those prototypes are brought into the realm of building. So it's a purposefully slow process. But at a fundamental level, I'm interested in how all of the work impacts the discipline of architecture, the way that we think about design, the methods that we produce, and also pedagogy, and then ultimately how it may impact the built environment and what we build as architects. So the first topic of the three concerns adaptive materials and the notion of personalizing architecture, and the first question that I started with in the beginning. And some of you, like Christoph, are familiar with this project, which started in 2010. It's titled eSkin. And in 2010, the National Science Foundation put out a call for collaborative teams that would include architects. And it was the first time that they had done so. And we had about 4 years of experience working together in the context of Lab Studio. This was still at Penn, which actually proved to be very beneficial in terms of procuring one of the 10 grants awarded across the states. So it includes mechanical engineers, Nader and Jan, Shu and the material scientists, Kiri, Ahida Stansberry, and Peter, the cell biologists, and myself, including Andrew Lucia and other graduate and undergraduate students coming from architecture. And so what the NSF was looking for were collaborative teams that really would fundamentally rethink our whole approach towards the problem of sustainability in architecture and issues of building energy. And so we proposed the development of thin film technology, passively responsive building skins that could be integrated into either existing construction or in new facade design. And our point of departure was this notion of dynamic reciprocity. So going back to some of the topics that I broached in terms of describing the extracellular matrix. So what you see here is a PDMS substrate, which is an organic polymer. It's been fabricated through photolithography, so pretty simple process at a micron scale, and this is being produced in Shu's lab. And this is a single smooth muscle cell, and a smooth muscle cell is a sort of covering outer cell within the human body. And you can see its cytoskeleton, its internal structure lassoing up and around these pillars. And so if we looked at this in section, you'd see a whole series of pillars in an array, and the nucleus stained in blue here. And so what we're really interested in is looking at how changes in compliance, changes in pattern, geometry, the proximity of the pillars, the height of the pillars, and so on, in turn affect the behavior of the cell. Now, we weren't proposing to put human cells on buildings or to put human cells in building skins. They work very well in our own bodies, but they would not work well at all at this scale. But they were our muse. They were our protagonists for a certain portion of the research to extract and synthesize a set of behaviors and features and effects within the material that we could then use to design sensors and imagers with the mechanical engineers that potentially could be locally dumb, but could learn over time, adapting to environmental cues and contextual changes within both the global environment, so site-based, as well as engaging user interaction on an interior level. So what are we exactly working with? So this is an example of a predefined geometric pattern. It's been embedded within a shape memory polymer, and the material is displaying structural color change under both deformation and recovery. And so literally what's happening is this PDMS, the organic polymer, is being stretched, right? So it's undergoing a mechanical change. And what then happens is either these pores or the pillars change their orientation. So if we think about those pillars, if you stretch it, they would all of a sudden do this, which in turn changes how light reflects and refracts. And then what we see is a change in color or transparency. So we were interested in extracting some of those features and effects, scaling them up, and thinking about the promise of a building skin that could adapt in a similar fashion. Now, we've had some constraints to deal with. We're currently limited to a 4-inch by 4-inch swath of the eSkin material. And for Shu and her group, that's huge in terms of length scales. That's a huge piece of material. And for myself and my team, that's ridiculous, right? What are we going to do with a 4-inch by 4-inch swath when we're thinking about skyscrapers? And that has to do with the amount of time it takes to fabricate and also cost for the most part. And I'll come back to these constraints in a moment in terms of some of the prototypes we've developed to manage those constraints. So our role involves, on the technical end, generating tools to visualize and simulate cell attraction forces and cell behavior based upon proximity to various constraints, such as forces distributed via a virtual extracellular matrix environment. And then, of course, we also integrate the material constraints that are coming forth through Shu's work and her team. And I should mention, early on, when Peter and I started to collaborate, some of the first deliverables, actually, to my surprise, happened on the biomedical end. And it had everything to do with what we found to be the most potent bridge in terms of an immediate point of collaboration, which was within visualization and simulation. And I was sort of blown away by what wasn't happening in Peter's lab in terms of how data was being modeled. And so it was very easy for myself and my team to begin to model that data and to visualize it in new ways, to develop parametric simulations. And that was, really rewarding for all of us, and especially as myself, thinking that, okay, wow, I can operate as an architect, as a designer, but in an entirely different field and an entirely different length scale. So in addition to the functional and optimal properties of the e-skin, in terms of how they would engage the reduction of building energy within buildings, one of the things that we've been looking at is the concept of a tunable window or a dynamic frit patterning. You're probably familiar with frit patterning within glazing. We've been working with the same changes that I just described in terms of blocking UV or letting sunlight to pass through, thinking about the changes that would happen throughout a day and how that could be imbued and designed and engineered within the e-skin material. But alongside those functional properties, everyone on the team is equally invested in issues of aesthetics and beauty, and how that becomes an important conceptual ground to consider when we're thinking about large-scale transformations at, say, an urban scale, and also thinking about community engagement and this topic of personalizing architecture and how that starts to touch issues of sustainability and engagement. So these are some of our latest speculative renderings. So we also, importantly, in addition to the technical modeling and data visualization and simulation, we operate as architects and constantly sort of pushing the team as to what this might be, how it might behave at an architectural scale. And so we're looking at the promise of a tunable window, which goes back to what I just previously described with those mechanical changes with the material being stretched. Imagine if you could create your own windows on demand in the interiors of your spaces. Also looking at a degree of user interaction, so sensing-based color change, and we've developed a series of prototypes looking at that, working with the actual optical data of the e-skin material that's been simulated with the help of the mechanical engineers, developing our own rendering engines to work with that dynamically and applying that to a set of virtual geometries that one can interact with. In this example, at the scale of a prototypical facade unit, at the scale of a room, and so on. The prototype that I think we're probably most proud of actually took us a little over a year to produce. We've been fortunate to receive a series of exhibition invitations, which I've leveraged as helpful deadlines for the team to also think about how we begin to scale up some of these features and effects. And I was invited to contribute work to the 9th Archilab at the Frock in Orléans, which was titled Naturalizing Architecture. And I contributed 2 bodies of work, one of which was e-skin, and I'll talk about the other one in a moment. And so we produced this prototype. We wanted to dynamically switch between opaque and transparent conditions, and then also to dynamically switch colors. And so this was our initial schematic in terms of how one might engage the prototype and engage also a degree of a sensing-based technology. And given the scalar constraints that we had at hand, we started to look at other materials that would exhibit the same features but would allow us to work at a human scale. And so we decided to work with what are known as nano-colloidal particles. And these particles are special. They're found in nature in things like seashells. They're found in milk products, anything that displays an opulent color spectrum. So this is a photograph of the final prototype. We made everything from scratch. We worked together at the lab bench side. I had people from my team working with Shu's team. We worked directly with the mechanical engineers who innovated the board. And this is a view of the internal makeup. There's an array of sensors that detect a change in light intensity, and then an array of components. And these components are composed of 2 sheets of what are called ITO glass, which basically is a conductive glass. And sandwiched between those 2 sheets is a solution of the nano-colloidal particles. And so what happens when you pass your hand by this thing or you walk past it, the sensors detect, again, a change in light intensity, which in turn sends a very low voltage regionally to these components, which in turn changes the packing density of those nano-colloidal particles, which then we see a change in color. And in the back, there's also an array of potentiometers, so we were able to, in the case of the gallery at the Frock, which was actually quite brightly lit by natural sunlight, we were able to tune the prototype to the specifics of the room. And this thing actually took literally over a year to produce. And beyond the sort of excitement of producing it and having it in the exhibition, I think the most important thing that this presented in the process of producing it was a series of, I'll say, sort of productive hurdles, which really start to engage the differences between fundamental research, basic science, which most of my collaborators do, and what we do as architects in terms of design research and projection and application. And so Shu and her team really aren't that concerned about application because it's not about what they do. And so I think for all of us on the team, it presented, again, a series of interesting hurdles to discuss and work through together collaboratively. And I'll touch upon some of those issues again in a moment. So we're now looking for industry partners to really move this material into a viable product that can be used in the building industry. 2014 marked the 4th year of the project. It's ongoing, and this is our sort of vision for how this might be integrated with new facade design, both on the interior as well as the exterior. So this project formed a bridge for a second NSF project, also in collaboration with Shu and a couple of new people. There we go. You don't need to listen to me while I'm talking to you. And this started in 2013. The NSF, within the same umbrella, which is the Emerging Frontiers for Research Innovation, which is the umbrella within the NSF that takes on sort of high-risk experimental work. And then they have sub-umbrellas within that. And so they were looking for collaborative teams that would engage the topic of origami, so folding. And we put in a proposal that would look at kirigami, which is origami, but with the addition of cuts and holes. And so the team includes Randy Kamian, who's a theoretical physicist based at Penn. He models squishy things. This is turn that off. This is a video that they produced, Randy and his team. So he models squishy stuff. He also models crystalline structures. So he's looking at the theories and models behind materials. We worked with him quite substantially the first year and a half, just probing the geometric principles of kirigami, moving from 2D flat sheet stamping to 3D form. And then also Shu and her team looking at 3D origami and the shaping and folding of elastic sheets. So one of the first experimental prototypes that we produced is called Color Folds, and I was very interested in, again, forming a bridge between all of the work that we had done with eSkin but moving away from single swaths of this material that are responsive to larger systems that would also change and adapt. And in our case, working with the specifics of Origami geometry as a point of departure. And we produced a whole series of paper models, moving into thicker materials. Again, working with Randy quite a lot the first year and a half, developing our own digital algorithms, et cetera, to really understand what we could work with. And then using the prototype as a way of beginning to manage scale and also thinking about, again, how we could deploy larger swaths of the e-skin material into this assembly with a bit of user interaction, as you can see highlighted in these diagrams. So this project really operates that middle phase, as I described, sort of starting with tools to model behavior and then moving into architectural prototyping. One of the PhD students that I'm on an advising committee for, he's a mechanical engineering student, Daniel Suluce. He participated in this project to work with us on the development of a pretty basic neural network in terms of how we programmed a series of actuators and boards with thermistors and nitinol springs. So rather than pre-programming the network, I was interested in having a degree of local awareness or learning behavior in terms of how these components would fold and unfold. Each component is CNC cut, so again, moving from 2D flat sheet to 3D form. Every single component is different, but as you know, we can, in terms of working with these geometries, we can produce a coherent whole in terms of the strategy of how they all come together and assemble. This was actually the drawing for the CNC mill. It's extruded 6 mil polycarbonate. We laminated the sheets ahead of time with dichroic film, which is wavelength dependent. It allowed us to work with the principles of structural color at this scale. And you can see in some of these assembly drawings, just in terms of one's shift in proximity, the high degree of change in color that would follow next. We made all of the boards ourselves. I don't typically take on mechatronics in our work. I'm much more interested in how we manipulate materials to elicit change and adaptation. But this was an opportunity to explore that within my team. We probably won't do it again, but it was a great series of learning lessons. MOSFETs, basic boards, thermistors, et cetera, and an array of nitinol springs, which are two-phase, so basic, just low charge going through those springs, which then allowed us to fold and unfold the components. And each component had its own board, and then everything was networked together. If any of you engage with this work, the biggest problem we had was power. How do we power this whole thing? And actually at the opening night, we figured it out in the end, but the opening night of this at Cornell, it was on view for about 4 months. We actually had 2 car batteries in my office networked up to this thing just to get it to run. So that was great. So we've now taken this apart and are continuing to work with it as a design experiment, as a prototype, and really innovating things with both Dan and a new collaborator, Spencer Magalby, who's a mechanical engineer based at BYU. He does incredible work with what he calls thick origami, again, moving from 2D to 3D, so stamping and so on. Also innovating at the micron scale. We have an Ember printer that was gifted to us from Autodesk, where we're just looking at how changes in pattern and geometry can also change compliance and more global behavior within the substrates. And really the interest is innovating hinge design. So we're looking at hinge design strategies at this scale. And then what I'm most excited about, and we're kind of in the middle of this, is working with Dan and the promise of programmable matter. So again, looking at 3D printed hydrogels with human synthetic DNA sequences to get them to actuate in various patterns. And so that's what we're working on right now in the lab. So we've scaled back down to a single component and the hinge design for those components. So I'm going to segue into the second of the three topics, which moves away from adaptive materials and thin film technology and Origami geometry into adaptive structures and form. And when I say adaptive structures, I don't necessarily mean literally moving in the final application or prototypes, but engaging processes and behaviors at the starting point that are truly adaptive, that are then filtered through material systems and constraints. And the following question: can generative fabrication give agency to material? So I'm really interested in how one can position a design process that continues to diminish the gap between design intent and the final fabricated form. So the notion of an inextricably linked set of scenarios that really goes back to the ECM and this notion of a dynamic reciprocity between context and form, where materiality, geometry, environment, etc., are not separate from each other, but are a part of a continuum. So we've been doing a lot of exciting work with 3D printing. In 2009, I purchased our first large format 3D printer, which is a powder-based printer. We continue to use it every day in the lab. And these are some data that were produced in Peter's lab. These are multicellular structures. One is undergoing tumorigenesis on this side, and the other is in a healthy scenario. And we were helping Peter model these data parametrically. And I was interested in working with the printer not as a representational tool, but to rapid manufacture parts, thinking about basic part-to-whole relationships, maximizing the build bed through assemblies that would have logics embedded within them for much larger assembled forms, thinking about issues of data visualization, how one potentially may hold data, which was extremely interesting to Peter in terms of scale. And it was in the production of this prototype, and I'm not going to talk about it specifically, that I realized that I had a lot of knowledge that was sort of a part of my body that I thought I had left far behind in ceramics. And one August afternoon, working with a printer, I thought, wait a minute, this is a powder material. Couldn't we perhaps put in a different powder material? And so we took out the proprietary media, and what you see here is a clay body, a high fire stoneware clay body that's mixed with maltodextrin fiber. You can find it in your local grocery store, and a little bit of sugar, fine sugar, which facilitates the printing process, so it makes it sticky. And these were our first successful clay parts, printed parts. They've been cleaned up here, and then the same part in the regular media. And here it's been printed in the high fire stoneware. It's been bisque fired, so chemically it's changed to ceramic, and then glaze fired. So that in and of itself just really was exciting and kind of blew me away. And so in parallel, a whole body of work in the area of digital ceramics has come forth since 2009 and has been formalized in several ways, one of which is through my teaching. And the first installment of this course was at Penn. I've now taught it, I think, 3 or 4 times at Cornell, and the title of it is Experiments in Building Construction Techniques, Digital Ceramics. And students are tasked with developing screen systems, walls if they're load-bearing, thinking about basic part-to-whole relationships, thick tiles and componentry. They also have to work with at least one outside constraint. So we're not working with sculpture here. We're starting to architecturalize these interfaces. In some cases, in this project, they were interested in working with the passage of light and the association of textiles to a kind of calcified tapestry or screen system. Here, working with plant matter and a logic for how water would filter through it. And in this case, looking at aperiodic tiling, and these are just a few examples. There's a ton of really amazing projects. They were interested in working with a glazing strategy, in this case a solar active glaze that would change color in the presence of the sun. And in the lab, we are probing a project called Polybrick, which we've been working on for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years now, which really goes back to that image of the two parts and the brick, right? And thinking about the metrics of the brick and how with the aid of 3D printing, we can work with much more non-standard forms and measurements, which really haven't been challenged for many, many, many years, simply because of how bricks are made through extrusion. And so the polybrick works with a mortarless strategy using the age-old means of dovetail joinery, so using gravity to create connections. These are some of the first prototypes. These have been bisque-fired. And we think we've produced the first full-scale mortarless, fully 3D printed ceramic brick wall. And if you're interested in some of the technical aspects of this in 3D printing, Skylar's now the editor of this, started by Hod Lipson. We produced a paper in this a couple of years ago. And we're now moving, now that we've solved a lot of the technical issues with this sort of basic waffle grid algorithm that you saw, we're now returning to nature, looking at bone formation, human bone formation, leveraging that to optimize for load paths through the wall. So thinking about how at the base it could be quite dense, and then as it moves up, it could become quite porous. And then also, very importantly, integrating other phenomena about human interaction, the passage of light, effects, and so on. And so we are working on a project that will be on view in about a year in an exhibition on 3D printing. And I can't say exactly where yet, but we're pretty excited about it. So this body of work in digital ceramics was the other half of the work that was also on view at the FROC in 2013 to 2014. And I was interested in leveraging all of that design research into a large spatial prototype that would be informed by my many years of investigation into cellular networking processes, this time not working with a specific data set, but more so synthesizing all of that knowledge into a set of design tools that we could begin to leverage into a spatial prototype, moving from part-to-part connections, thinking about how one spatializes a node to node, how those form sheets. Those sheets continue to fold and bifurcate to form larger coherent structures. And so the project is composed of 3 components that have about 250 different ways of interweaving. And there's a very, very simple background organization based on an equilateral and isosceles triangle, which you can see here in this drawing. And some early renderings of the final spatial prototype. It's not spherical. There's actually 3 inversions, which you'll see in a moment. And it's housed within the new edition that's by Jacob and McFarlane that's a part of the FROC in Orléans. And if you haven't had a chance to visit the FROC, I highly recommend it. It's about an hour's train ride outside of Paris. They have one of the most important, if not the most important, collections of experimental architectural works, drawings, models, etc., from the 1960s to present. And Marie-Ange Brère and Frédéric Migrou, who are both now at the Pompidou, started this collection and have really embraced a lot of young architects engaging in emerging technologies and design from the 90s to now. So with this project, I didn't want to directly print the components, but I wanted to leverage the use of the printer to optimize for mold production and slip casting. And so if you know anything about slip casting, it's actually extremely difficult to work with parts that have a high degree of complex curvature and also have 2-part simple molds. Usually you would have 4 to 6 to 8-part molds so to release the part without damaging it. And so we were able to optimize for those conditions to then 3D print positives, basically cutting through one of those components, albeit not at a perfect, it's kind of a wonky cut, to deal with the curvature. And then making plaster molds, plaster negative molds from that. And with slip casting, you have to work with plaster because it wicks away the moisture from the part to effectively release it. So we made 20 molds per part so that we could cast about 90 parts per day. I hired 2 ceramic sculptors to lead the production. This is Jillian, who was just absolutely amazing. This was in my studio that at the time was still based in Philly. Now everything's based in Ithaca, which is great. And so what started out as a fairly sophisticated digital design process then became very slow and very analog and very much about the hand and making. And so these are some of the first completed components. We did all of this, the slip casting and the bisque firing in my studio, and then I outsourced the glazing. And this gives you a sense of the assembly. And so when you work with slip casting, you end up with a hollow part, which was very important to the structural logic of the system. And so running between all of the components is a continuous network of stainless steel cable in continuous tension, bringing all of the components into compression. This was our map for I believe, the upper surface of the final form. And so the way that we worked, we would assemble swaths or parts, pre-tension those, and then connect them to their neighboring swaths. And so this is how everything arrived to Orléans, all 1,400 digitally produced and hand-cast ceramic components. And thankfully, nothing broke while it was en route. And I didn't sleep very much until it arrived, but everything arrived safely. We worked with a really amazing local team of architecture students, and I think we got the award for the longest assembly process. Never do this again. But really amazing. So here's an example of one of those parts, TP3. It's locally tensioned, and then here you can see it's starting to take shape. So this whole thing is rigid, right? And at this point, I think the curators thought I was a little nuts, putting 1,400 ceramic pieces into tension, suspended about 2,000 pounds from this, what they call the turbulence, which is a giant skylight. Again, this is the addition by Jacob and McFarlane. But here you can see some of the lacy, calcified, woven material expressions starting to emerge as this thing was installed in what is now its permanent home. And some final images of that, one of the inversions here, and then you can see 3 of them here. So at strategic areas, the cable was allowed to exit, and then that's what we used to suspend it to this armature that thankfully they put in a catwalk. I don't think it was for us, but it was absolutely perfect. And just a little side note, Frederick Migru came by, I think on one of the last days of installation, and he was looking at it for quite some time, and then he came over to me and he said, "You're really smart." And I was sort of perplexed, and he said, "That's not going anywhere." And I will admit that I had some ideas as to how we would take it down, but I was extremely happy that he really liked it, but he also was happy to have it stay there permanently. So it's been there for almost 4 years and has not fallen down, and nothing is broken. So if you have a chance to see it, it's there at the Frock. So I'm going to conclude with the final topic and describe 2 projects within it. And I should mention that this project and these next 2 projects were produced in my studio practice. And it's been a really interesting endeavor over the last decade in terms of crafting a model based on a scientific structure for a lab in an architecture department in school. And as Caitlin mentioned, I basically wear 3 integrated hats. One is an educator, obviously, then one is a principal investigator of Sabin Design Lab, and then principal of Jenny Sabin Studio. On paper, those 2 entities are separate, primarily because of funding, but in reality, they're very integrated. So the studio allows me to take the fundamental ideas we're probing and apply them in the context of briefs and commissions. So the next 2 projects deal with textiles and textile tectonics, and came forth Through actually a number of years looking at weaving, I'm fascinated with weaving for a couple of reasons. I won't go into it. I could spend a whole lecture talking about weaving. But one, its relationship to computation, mechanization of the jacquard loom, the invention of the punch card, its influence on Babbage's steam-driven calculation device, and eventually the first IBM computers, and thinking about the linkages between material and digital space. And then also the linkages between weaving and architecture, primarily looking at the Bauhaus and the weaving workshop and what the women did during that time in terms of industry practice and the development of what they called polytextile. So in this project, we weren't working with weaving, but working with knitting. And it came to me as a commission from Nike, and they had launched what they called the Flyknit Collective, and it was in conjunction with a new technology that they had developed, which essentially is knitting shoes, which is called Flyknit. I think all of you know what Flyknit is now, but they were launching it in 2012, and so they invited 6 designers and architects from around the world to basically riff on the core benefits of Flyknit, which they called performance, lightness, sustainability, form-fitting, and so on. And they were genuinely interested in how we might bring those benefits back into our own fields and possibly scale them up. And so it was a very open-ended brief. I represented the States, and my city was New York. And what I pitched to them in terms of a final deliverable would be a pavilion that would integrate the complexities of the human body. So again, starting with the human body as a ground, as an active datascape, with the simplicity of knitting. And out of the 6 architects, and that's Ben Schaefer, he worked on Flyknit for 10 years. It was his baby at Nike, really amazing guy. Out of the 6 invited designers and architects, I was the only one that wanted to work with knitting, and they were actually surprised by that. And I was like, well, it's Flyknit. Of course we're going to work with knitting. And so we launched the project, and I organized a few workshops, some of the footage you just saw in that movie. The first workshop, actually I should talk a little bit about this. Although I knew a lot about weaving, I didn't know so much about knitting. And so I started a collaboration with Anne Emling, who is a knitter, textile designer, and at the time was at RISD. And so we spent a long weekend with her just really figuring out which parameters we could work with and what was possible. We worked with mechanical knitting machines, we knitted by hand, we worked with a Stoll digital knitting machine, thinking about changes in density, tension, working with these fundamental parameters in knitting, holes, ladders, gathering, tapering, scale, what happens when we start to scale up these material systems. And then came the workshops that I organized in Manhattan with about 30 participants from diverse backgrounds, from athletics to fashion design to graffiti arts to architecture. And the first workshop was really the intention was to produce a bunch of data. And so we outfitted all of the participants with sensors, sent them out into the city, various activities, and collected a huge data dump of biodata, temperature, heartbeat, and so on. And then the second workshop, this is a photo from that second workshop, it was really all about making sense of that data. And so we had workstations, areas of expertise where the participants could simulate their data and then actually literally knit it with Anne, with the intention of not just mapping or representing the data, but really looking at the intangible and hidden structures of that data to dynamically steer and specify the parameters of knitting and to begin to work with those flows of tension, et cetera, and how they might change and adapt relative to the structure of the data. I was also interested in working with high-tech yarns, again, to accentuate those qualities. And so I elected to work with photoluminescent yarn and solar active yarn, as well as reflective threads. So this is the reflective. And basically, at a micron scale, there's thousands of little beads And so when you either take a flash photograph or shine light on it, it immediately sends out a burst of light. The photoluminescent absorbs UV and then emits light or glows, and the solar active changes color in the presence of the sun, and when it's not activated, it's white. So we took all of those assets from both of the workshops and brought them back to my studio and started to develop a series of simulations looking at the time, I was interested in individual knitted elements, again, having the data filter through that as a gradient, not as a map or as a representation, but looking at the hidden structures that would emerge through that data as a kind of muse or protagonist, and some of the early schematics for the pavilion. So I was a little bit naive, or productively naive, in thinking that it would be easy to find a knit manufacturer in the States. And so when it came time to start production, this was an incredibly fast project. It's amazing what Nike does in a day. It just blew me away. So for them, 4 months was like, 10 years. So it was a very fast project. But I was fortunate to finally come across Shima Siki, and they are a Japanese company at the forefront of what's called whole garment knitting. And one could say that knitting is actually the first example of 3D printing, right? So additively layering, link by link, row by row material. And so they make the machines, and then they also do production. And so literally what you see here is a three-dimensional seamless knitted form. And so they do shaping dynamically to produce these forms. And so they are absolutely perfect. And they have a warehouse and factory in northern New Jersey, which was right between my studio and the venue. So we worked with them for about 2 weeks, just really trying to figure out how to interface their machines, which have a CAD-CAM interface, pretty crude interface. The learning curve was quite steep, but Shima and their team there were incredibly excited about innovating with us. They primarily work at the scale of the human body. They work in haute couture. You can sort of speculate as to who they work with, Issey Miyake and so on. And so we came up with a kit of parts ranging from approximately 2 feet to upwards 45 feet in length, a family of conoids or cones. And those were all individually knit. This was a drawing highlighting the data streams and the ways that they were attached to the parameters of knitting. In the end, we worked with holes, ladders, which essentially are an extended hole, changes in tension, and then the distribution of the 3 different materials, and a fourth, which was drake, just a fill. And sort of counterintuitively, with more holes, one would think that the knit fabric would get, the elasticity would change, but it actually starts to get quite stiff because it essentially forms a series of knots within the material. And so we did a ton of analog tests in the studio, literally just stretching these cones, measuring the change and implementing it into our form-finding tools. And thinking about, again, the final design proposal. And I was interested in moving sort of spatially between a transition that would feature a harder outer shell, which was composed of hundreds of water jet cut aluminum rings pulled into tension, so essentially forming a static frame. And that moving into a sort of soft, organic, supple architectural textile that was inhabitable. So once we had all of the individual cones knitted, and that was no small feat, it came time to finish them and to sew them to their neighbors. And so I worked with a finisher called Daisian. They kind of have the whole market on fabric structures and theatrical fabric works. They've done a couple of collaborative projects for PS1. And so this was the drawing that we used for the seaming and the finishing. We literally plotted this 1-to-1, and all of the finishing was done with sewing machines, individual sewing machines, pre-tensioned with this twill tape. And then just a little side note, they marked all of the edges with black Sharpie. Somehow they thought there was one side that you wouldn't see. I will say I don't work with these guys anymore. And I think we bought out all of the white medical tape in Lower Manhattan to cover this for the opening. One of the best parts of the project is that the fabric structure weighs about 150 pounds and fits into a single canvas bag that you can see here. And here, highlighting the assembly process, each cone has a home within the ring network, which is pulled into tension, and then there's an outer ring that finishes it, sandwiched with an array of felt washers and then mechanically fastened. And so we tuned it kind of like a drum, clockwise, to limit rips and tears in the fabric. And here you can see it fully installed, and at the base, a taut elliptical ring that was formed, and this is the area that one can inhabit on the interior. And I have to say, with all the tests and the simulations, the analog modeling, model tests, and so on, it actually, I knew it was going to work, but I was still nervous. But I was more than pleased in terms of how it came out. So I worked with a lighting designer to simulate a day to night sequence over about an hour. Is about an hour's length. And here you can see the photoluminescent yarns being activated. So sort of dusk or night. And it actually articulated the construction process of each element. Here you can see, again, the photoluminescent threads activated, expressing a kind of three-dimensional drawing. The space between the ring network and the outer portion or surface of the fabric structure, an exterior shot. It was on view for about 4 months in the Lower East Side at a place called Nike Stadium, which is basically kind of Nike's groovy showroom. They do events there. And it comfortably houses about 50 people. And some additional shots. Nike's been an incredible collaborator and partner. They invited me back to do another commission project in Berlin about a year later, which allowed us to take all of that R&D and do a much quicker project and a much bigger structure. I'm not going to talk about that one tonight, but I'll end with what is the fourth project within this series in my studio, which is a commission that came to me through the Cooper Hewitt Design Triennial. And I think I see Thomas in the room. Thomas was my engineer at Arup. And I was really interested in this project. Well, I should mention it's a part of their fifth design triennial, which brings together designers and architects and artists from diverse disciplines, from font design to industrial product design, to fashion, to architecture. But I was really interested in developing a structure, again, a kind of dynamic reciprocity between the armature and the fabric architecture. And these are some gifts that Thomas produced. We worked together for about 3 months quite intensely, producing these analog models and tests, and taking all of those parameters and infiltrating them into our form-finding tools and simulations. We had about 45 swatches, I think, produced by Shima with various hole patterns and so on, changes in material, to really get rigorous with the material and its performance. And the idea, again, kind of going back to my starting point of thinking of the flow of force through geometry and matter as an active set of parameters, and how does one really work with feedback in design and issues of making and fabricating in a dynamic way as a set of inextricably linked scenarios. And so, again, I wanted to work not with a static frame like with the ring networks, but with an armature that could potentially also be active. We went back and forth due to the budget from, do we do an extruded tube that would be static, which would be easier to manage, or do we do something that's formed of bundled fiberglass rods, which would actually be much better, but much more unpredictable. And we elected to go with the more complex version. And we did a whole series of generative models looking at minimal surfaces and, again, looking at the promise of the use of force and its relationship to morphology and form as a kind of dynamic design space, considering the differentiation of the cells and their deployment and their connections. And in the case of this project, again, looking at a much more integrated scenario, I wanted to work with an inner and outer surface connected with the cones that then would attach to this armature. So you can see here the array of cones creating those connections, and then in the final installed state, that in-between space. Again, working with photoluminescent and solar active threads, a 3D print of the final pavilion and some drawings. It occupies an entire gallery, so I think this is the third floor of the Cooper. And so you're forced through it to enter the rest of the gallery here. And given that this was the fourth in a sequence and the product of about 4.5 years of, almost 5 years of inquiry into this material system, I think we've really started to nail some things, especially with the engineering collaboration with Thomas and Arup. And I worked with two amazing outfits in Philadelphia who did the finishing work, Andrew Dahlgren, and then a company called All Sewn Together. At first it was Andrew, and then we realized we're not going to finish on time. And so I thankfully, with Andrew, found this company. And we're really innovating some interesting strategies for how to automate the finishing process through some systems that he has in place. So just a few shots of the installation. Here you can see the active bending structure, which is composed of 19, in cross-section, 19 fiberglass rods connected with couplers, stainless steel couplers. It's about 100 feet in perimeter. And these ropes doing the work of what the fabric will do, and then 3 weights as counterbalances. And then some shots of it finally installed. The outer surface here, the inner, and some detail shots. Again, I worked with a lighting designer, this time simulating a day-to-night sequence over about 17 minutes, and some shots of the opening night. The exhibition's on view through August 21st at the Cooper. If you have a chance, it's really great. Some of your fellow faculty are in it. Neri Oxman's work from the Mediated Matter group is down here. And many others. Really incredible show. And so I'll conclude with a sort of following statement to summarize everything I've talked about. I've shown you a sort of cross-section of both the research and the studio work. If you're interested in seeing more, these are our websites. And we've been fortunate over the last 12 years now to receive quite a lot of funding, both from the sciences, the NIH, the NSF, as well as architectural venues, which has really allowed us to formalize the work and push it into some pretty amazing trajectories. So I'll conclude with the following. While the exploration of biological and nano to microscale material properties and effects at the human scale form the starting points for many of the featured projects, it's the disciplinary hurdles, remember that E-skin prototype, that we encounter through the production of projects across scales that culminate in what is perhaps the most potent deliverable in my mind. The projects keep me going, the teaching keeps me active and excited. But the most important deliverable to date is this new model for transdisciplinary collaboration, I think, in terms of impact. The scalar constraints that we encounter span material sciences. We've seen cell biology, textile engineering, fashion, sport, electrical and systems engineering, and architecture, which in turn challenge the differences between fundamental and applied research. Again, thinking about the differences between hypothesis-driven research and what we do as designers. The creative navigation of this ambiguous line between science and architecture in turn offers up a unique model for collaboration across disciplines that defines what I think is a new future for architecture, and also, importantly, the role of the architect, where authorship is horizontal, giving way to interiorities, elastic networks, fabrics, and topological meanders that are both pliable, plastic, and open. And it's here, as I've stated, that geometry and matter are steered and specified by the flexibility and sensitivity of the human body, kind of deep obsession between that dynamic reciprocity that I talked about and that's present within the ECM, also within weaving, the relationship between digital space and materiality, the kind of co-production of a materially driven design process. And so it's here that perhaps the most important deliverable to date is this new model for collaboration across disciplines, offering both a bridge and obviously a point of departure into new projects and trajectories. I don't work alone. These are some people that are part of my team, which continues to grow. Andrew Lucia, he was one of our first research associates in Lab Studio at Penn, then taught visualization courses at Penn, and then came to Cornell with me and is now teaching at University of Minnesota as a fellow and assistant professor and doing some really amazing work in his own practice, primarily looking at information-based technologies and materiality. Martin Miller, who was also senior personnel, part of the Origami project, and taught for about 3 years at Cornell, and then many of my graduate and undergraduate students that continue to take part in the work. And just one last point that I'm really excited about. We're in the final stages of approval for what will be a new degree program. It'll be a 2-year Master's of Science in Architectural Science with a concentration in matter, design, computation. And purposefully, we're not requiring that you have a prior degree in architecture, so we'll allow biologists and material scientists to come and do a 2-year thesis, be fully funded, and also work on the core lab research and engage in teaching as teaching associates. And we'll have our first student matriculated this coming fall. So I'm really excited about that in terms of looking at a long-term sustainable future for both the lab and the core work. So with that, I'll conclude, and really happy to take questions or comments. Thanks for coming out tonight.
Thank you, Jenny, for a super inspiring talk. We do have time. It looks like some people have to go, but we do have time for some questions. So who'd like to go first? Great. Well, I'll go first then. I liked what you said at the end, Jenny, about horizontal authorship, which is pretty interesting. And you told a quick anecdote at the beginning about it took about a year for you and one of your earlier collaborators to learn the same language and kind of figure out how to work together in a kind of productive way that was really engaging for both of you. Can you talk a little bit more about how you, now you're kind of an expert at this, how do you onboard new collaborators? How do you find people who are doing fundamental science research who are interested and capable of collaborating with you? How does that process work?
I mean, sometimes it's very directed in terms of needing to find someone, like in the case of Anne, I wanted to take on the topic of knitting in a rigorous fashion, so that was more of a directed, I need to find someone who's really good at this. And also in the core research, there are similar scenarios, like with the Polybrick project. Now that I'm moving into looking at models of human bone formation, I sought out and found someone at Cornell that I actually didn't think there was going to be someone at Cornell, but there is someone at Cornell who's working on it in the context of materials and material science. So that's sort of one way that I do it, which is very directed. But usually it's just you meet someone and at a conference, at a lecture, at an opening, and you strike up a conversation. And I think I've developed an intuition for knowing when it's like, oh, that's going to be good, right? And there's a kind of synergy that happens. So, like for example, I met Guy Hoffman, I don't know, a couple weeks ago amazing work in robotics and human interaction. Did his PhD here in the Media Lab, or postdoc, can't remember which. Thinking about issues of empathy and personalization. And I invited him to sit on a thesis review for one of my students. And then he and, we just had this awesome conversation. And so at the end of it, now we want to do something with ceramics and what he's doing with robotics. So oftentimes it's usually just that. And I've also had to be careful. I've had high-level scientists contact me to be a part of proposals, that I initially was extremely excited about, and kind of quickly realized that I was either just being used for my ideas or was the kind of poster child coming from architecture doing wild things that would kind of bolster the proposal. And so I always pull myself out of that because it's pretty clear that my involvement will be sort of short-sighted. So yeah, really, I think it's been about people. And not everyone is into this. As you guys know, in the sciences, this kind of collaborative work is not everybody's thing. And that people are usually pretty clear about that. So, yeah.
I can be pretty loud. All right. You mentioned this new program that you're doing at Cornell.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there should be changes made to traditional architectural curriculum, or is it something that's supplemental?
No, I think there should be definitely changes made. Yeah. This option studio that I'm teaching, I started with the video clips that I just got a few new ones right before I came here. It's not often that, I love teaching. I teach too much, but I love teaching. But it's not often that teaching aligns with your core research and interests. But this semester, it really is. And I haven't been this excited about teaching in a long while. And the students feel it. They're they're so excited because they really feel like they're contributing to something that is pretty serious and pretty novel. And that's just, I think, I would love to see that happen more often. So that's an example where, I bought a robot, got a grant, bought a robot, brought it to Cornell, spent 9 months with my lab getting to know it, and then I felt comfortable and confident that we could unleash it upon the students. But there's a whole theoretical and kind of methodological approach that we're taking. It's not just, sort of taking advantage of the technology. But anyway, my sort of short answer is that it's really hard to do this within the structures of, a professional degree program that has all of the requirements that, as you guys know, that the required courses, the core courses. My current undergraduate and graduate students they work in the lab on top of everything else that they do. And so the summers are our most productive time in that regard. But I have eked out a model over the last 5 years, like with Andy and Martin. They were senior personnel, research associates in the lab, so 50% of their time went to the research, and then the other 50% of the time they were teaching, so they're gaining teaching experience. And basically, it's kind of like a postdoc in the sciences. So that worked quite well, and I'll probably continue that, but it'll now be formalized through this new degree program. So I'm tired, and it's hard to do this in a professional degree situation. Maybe it would be easier in a different format. So yeah, I think things need to change, but I also think the structures and the models that are in place are pretty hard to shift. Christoph and I were a part of a conference that was all about that, really, like issues of pedagogy and research, and we wanted deans to come, and not many came. think it will change. I think people like my students will be the ones that are maybe getting more sleep.
Well, maybe a question, then even though I love your work, and I think this knitting, the theme of knitting now with all these structures that really come together, which is fabulous. I really like also that you always present this work like scientists would, and that your collaborators are mentioned.
Yeah.
I think that's just a wonderful thing. When I see a lot of this is obviously something where you become better and better at. So it's like a body of scientific knowledge, of design knowledge
Mm-hmm.
that you are now mastering. So what do you think are now the vehicles to share this with others? So in science, it would to write a paper on how to do this. You're probably not going to write a paper on how to build something like this. Or is it through these new degree programs that these are become basically skill sets that you plan to teach?
In terms of how this loops back to the...
That it just becomes that that not only, let me say it, in studio or labs knows how to do that,
Mm-hmm.
but that more people in the world know how to build these things. And then, of course, tomorrow it's knitting, maybe it's a bead building one day, but there has to be some mechanism. I think a
Right.
lot of designers that work on exhibition kind of keep it in-house, and then nobody else in the world knows how to do it, right?
Yeah, no, well, with every project, well, I try, it depends on time, but every project also typically has an associated technical paper that I'll publish either in Acadia or CIMOD or Journal of Architectural Computing. In fact, Thomas and I are going to work on a paper together collaboratively on this last project that will be very technical and talking about all the processes that went into the design. So that's one way that the work is shared, and then obviously shared at a kind of exhibition level in terms of people's engagement with it. But that's, I don't think, it's not broaching your question. So papers, publishing, and then also I'm like, I've been working with the photoluminescent and solar active threads, but I want to get into the, like, at the nanoscale, the science behind that. And Juan Hinstrosa, who is at Cornell, he's also a part of that big DoD textile grant that MIT is leading that was announced a few weeks ago. He's doing amazing, he's in fiber science, and he's doing amazing things with fibers at the nanoscale. And so we just put in a proposal together to really start to innovate at that level. So that's another way that I think the work will continue in terms of refinement. Yeah.
Question about, all of the projects are so mesmerizing and tend to follow the trend of scaling up. So going from a very small scale and then looking at how kind of that gets larger. And I was wondering whether, or in what way does building science, in a way, or the operation of buildings then get translated in the other direction. So how that kind of comes back down. And I can see like maybe the structural principles, but in a way, can the operation of buildings or the way that we use them, how is that informing the work?
I want to make sure I understand your question correctly. So engaging sort of fundamentals of building science and as a point of departure. Well, I mean, my area of expertise is not in sustainability or environmental systems, but the work touches it, especially like with the eSkin project, through other avenues. And so my point of departure is not typically starting with the fundamentals of building science. Tamir Dogan, one of your PhD students who just joined our faculty, and we've been sort of scheming on some collaborations. I mean, that is his core expertise in terms of daylighting and urbanism and urban issues. So I'm interested in that, like how do I collaborate with someone where their disciplinary core is in that area. I'm not going to pretend that that's my area of expertise. But with the eSkin project, for me, we started with materials, really, and materials is they integrate with the dynamics of biology. And I think in a lot of the work that's present. And then that starts to touch upon some of the issues that you're talking about, especially in some of the advanced tools that we developed. We got the best paper award at CIMAUD in 2014 for all of the simulation tools that we had to develop just to render these material properties. And then we started to integrate just really, really basic contextual constraints. And I think, Christoph, you and I had some interesting conversations about how that could be made more rigorous based on what you do. So that's how I approach it. I don't know if that answers your question, but I try and be really careful with what I'm good at